Welcome to Authors Alcove for Fantasy Writers. I'm your guest host for the day, Addy Dulac. I am the published author of three books, including the Troublemakers Trilogy. I am temporarily filling in for Agnes Wolfe, the usual host and founder of Authors Alcove. This is episode 31 of the Story Savvy series, where Rebecca, the developmental editor of Heartbound Editing, is helping your usual host, Agnes Wolfe, and many other authors, such as myself, self-edit my good story into a great one. If you haven't already, I encourage you to like and subscribe to this podcast. You can also join the Authors Alcove community on Patreon or check out the new membership site at authorsalcove.com. Last week, Rebecca and Agnes went over the all-important topic of scene core events. Today, we are going to take a look at avoiding scene stagnation.
Hello, I'm happy to be here, and I am so thankful to you for stepping in. I'm excited to tackle this topic of avoiding common scene stallouts and how to
Mhm.
self-edit to fix them. By the end of this episode, you'll all hopefully feel confident identifying where you may have a stagnant scene or part of a scene, and have some really solid tools in hand for adding variety, immersion, and interest. Addie, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your writing before we dive in with our first question here?
Ooh, okay. Well, a little bit about my writing. So I've been writing sort of unofficially since I was in the eighth grade, but I published my first novel, One Season with the Duke, in 2023, during the Great Plague. I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago. It's an island, little island off the coast of Venezuela, and the culture there is truly multicultural and truly multi-ethnic. It it's interracial couples are sort of like the standard. You barely find anybody who's just one ethnicity. Everybody is everything, and you can see it in you can see it in their face. You can hear it in their names. You'll find somebody named like Arthur Gonzalez, and he's Korean, and you're just like, okay, trucks, right? So that's the kind of culture that I grew up in. So my stories that I tend to write, they tend to follow that idea and delve into that example and the difficulties that people will face from when you're creating a couple that sort of blends different racial identities, different cultures, different socioeconomic groups, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of the internal, or at least some of the internal tension, is going to be there, and also that ends up giving a lot of fodder for external tension, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on there. I'm also a student of history, so while I do take a little bit of creative license for the sake of, the romance novel aesthetic, I do try to stay true to the reality of the racial demographics of Europe and the UK between the 18th and 19th centuries, because that's the area and time in which I generally write. So if it's legally or theoretically possible based on a historical fact, then it's probably going to be in there. So the fact is, there's a lot of racial mixing going on, right? England has conquered half the globe, if not the whole damn thing. And they're pulling all these different ethnicities into they're either pulling them into England proper, or their army is going out into these places. These military men are marrying, and they're having these children, and they're bringing them in, right? And we all know the second or third born sons, they're probably going into the military. So if enough people die, you could end up with with a mixed race baron coming in here, and you're just like, what is happening? That's what happened. So writing wise, I think I'm traditionally called a plantser, where you're sort of combining plotting and pantsing. I need a strong framework from which to begin writing. I find it very difficult to organize my thoughts if I don't have some kind of a framework to work from. And I
Okay.
always have a pretty good idea of my characters the or an idea of the backstory or stories that I would like to use them for. So normally I need a framework to sort of organize that. And then after I've done that, I sort of start writing and I let the story take me wherever it's gonna go, right? I let the characters live their lives, and I'm just sort of kind of catching up with my little finger. Um, I love writing. I like a little bit of comedy, but I also love a lot of drama and romance. I love hurting people's feelings when I'm writing. I like I like high emotional stakes, and I am pro third act breakups. I will not be taking any feedback on this when they are appropriate. I love me a third act breakup. And also, I like beta males better than alpha males. I find alpha males very annoying, both in real life and generally in stories. So my males tend towards, the nurturing type. That's what I like to write.
Very nice.
That's me. So, Rebecca, what is scene stagnation and why is it a problem?
Scene stagnation is when a whole scene or part of it or a specific aspect of it isn't moving or is just too much of the same thing going on and on and on.
Mhm,
This is a problem because you really don't want your readers to just sort of space out while they're reading or listening to it as an audiobook. And I was thinking about this in the car the other day. I was listening through an audiobook and it there was a whole scene where I realized that I wasn't thinking about what I was listening to at all because there wasn't enough happening in the scene to hold my interest. This is also a problem because it can make it a lot harder to deliver a core event, like I talked about in the last episode. If you are trying to deliver a core event of, I'll go back to that same example I used there of, all right, well, my female main character is realizing that her husband has been sabotaging her career, and the whole scene, apart from that sentence, is really boring. That moment isn't going to land.
mhm, okay. So, how is this different from the topic of pacing, and why are we talking about it again here at this stage of the process?
Sure. It is very much related to
Okay.
pacing. However, scene stagnation has nothing to do with the intensity of a scene and a lot more to do with the smaller scale choices, like having the characters move around the setting or adding and removing dialogue and that sort of thing. I wanted to wait until now in the series to talk about this because pacing is a bigger issue
Mm,
which needs to be addressed while looking at how scenes move into and out of each other and looking at the patterns of intensity across sequences of scenes and to be looked at in the context of stakes and genre and these other big considerations.
mm,
Scene stagnation, on the other hand, is very much a scene by scene check that only matters within a compartmentalized scene and doesn't need to be connected in any of these bigger ways to those topics like genre or stakes.
mm. As an editor, what are some common mistakes around scene stagnation that you see in other people's work?
It usually comes down to missing the right balance between the aspects of dialogue, description, and agency or action, if you want to look at it that way. So the common mistakes are talking heads, where it's just dialogue, and you've got a page or more of just dialogue, she said, dialogue, he asked,
Mhm.
dialogue, she intoned, whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
markers you're using. If it's just pages of dialogue and it's you could imagine it playing out as just these two heads talking to each other with nothing actually happening around them,
Mhm,
that's a stagnation issue. On the description point, if you're describing a lot of things that don't matter to
mhm,
the story that's playing out and don't move that story forward, if you're doing those descriptions in too much depth or length, that's another stagnation issue.
mhm,
And then on the agency side, I've pretty much already said it, but it's when you don't have things happening or you have everything happening and no one is talking about it, nobody is thinking about it or processing or trying to affect it. So these all need to be kept in balance. And then these sort of red flags can also look like a lack of emotion
mhm,
to any degree in a scene if it's just really emotionally flat and no one is feeling or showing or expressing any emotions. It can also look like a lack of goals, motive, or conflict in play. You really do need to have something pushing them forward, pulling them forward, or causing hurdles in that momentum. And then lastly, one of the red flags that I've seen and work that I've worked on is that nothing really changes from the beginning of the scene to the end. And that very much goes back to the last episode on core scene events.
What is the difference between a slow paced scene and a stagnant scene? Is there a difference?
There's definitely overlap, like I mentioned earlier. A slow-paced scene is low stakes and low emotion, as I talked about in episode 13 on this topic. A stagnant scene is one that lacks surface level interest, one that misses that balance between dialogue description and things being done. So there's not much difference. But again, pacing looks at the scene holistically within the highs and lows of the whole book and your general, tension, what's the word I'm looking for? Like Goldilocks zone. But
Mm,
sorry, stagnation just cares about each page or paragraph or scene at one at a time.
mm. Where's the line between just a style choice or stagnation on those points you listed earlier? For example, speaking to specifically that talking heads one, what would be classified as just a dialogue heavy scene, and where does it cross into the line of talking head?
This can be very subjective and something you just kind of need to feel out. But the tool that I've given clients in the past is think about imagination cool down. So when you are given a visual description of a character or the room that they are doing things in, you have the strongest visual of that in the moment that it is being described. And then over the following seconds or minutes, that starts fading out as other things come to the forefront of that imagination. So try to keep enough of those descriptions and actions involved so that the readers keep their sense of who is speaking and where and under what conditions often enough that it doesn't have a chance to fade completely to black. So, dialogue heavy scenes still need to have a backdrop of things happening, and vice versa. If you have a very descriptive scene, you still need to have some dialogue to let those descriptions have context in the story being told. I hope that makes sense.
Sometimes, like when you have a dialogue heavy scene, if it's like a talking head situation, when it starts off, it could just be showing like how fast the dialogue is going back and forth. Because a lot of times, if you're trying to show they're just bouncing back and forth off each other, you don't have time. Like, it's not going to be believable that the character is taking all this time to note all these things. It's like, no, respond. But you can't do that for like a whole page, right? So, like, maybe you count it off at like three or four exchanges, and then you're like, okay, now somebody needs to describe something. Like somebody
Yeah.
needs to do something with their face or something.
And give the visuals first. So
Mm,
set things up and then do some back and forth and then give it a line
mhm.
of refreshing those visuals, refreshing that interaction with
Right.
the setting, and then like you said, do another half page of the
Hmm.
snappy back and forth. It's all about keeping that mix and that variety.
Yeah. So, what are some red flags we should look out for in our own work that may suggest that it is stagnant?
Oh boy. So hopefully I've already given listeners some things to watch for, but
Hmm.
running through a bit of a list to answer that. It's a red flag if most of a page is all dialogue with no movement, no actions, anything like that. It's a red flag if there is a lack of goals, motives, or conflicts in play. If you can't point to any goals, motives, or conflicts in a scene, it probably has some level of stagnation worth addressing. It's a red flag if dialogue or description with minimal action is more than 2/3 of a page or a scene. Again, balance, and 2/3 of one thing tends to be sort of that outward cusp for it starting to
Hmm.
feel stagnant. It's a red flag if you had flagged a given scene as incredibly low intensity back when we were talking about pacing and you weren't sure how to fix that. Maybe now revisit that with this toolkit and see if that can help. And then lastly, and as always, if you get a critique partner or a beta reader or anything like that, and you get feedback on a scene or a chapter that says something like, oh, this felt really slow, or man, my interest really kind of fell away. This didn't hold my interest. Why did you include this scene? Anything like that. That's good feedback that you should pay attention to and go in and see if there are surface level changes like these that you can make to fix that.
So if a scene is stagnant, how can we face it? How can we fix that?
So it really depends on what the kind of stagnation is. So first you need
Mhm.
to name that and then you can go on from there. So replace thoughts and narration with dialogue. If you think you're just really, really heavy on descriptions and nothing much is happening, forcing lines to simply get said out loud can help with that service level interest. You can also try changing the setting of the scene to force actions and interactions. This is probably the one that I end up recommending the most and that I make good use of in my own books. If a scene is stagnant, move it outdoors, change it from home to work,
Mhm,
change it from a quiet private location to a loud, very public one. If you just change where this scene is taking place, that can do a lot of good to that stagnation
mhm,
issue. You can also try adding in other characters to create conflict. If it's currently stagnant as a conversation between, the two lovers, toss the antagonist in the mix and see how that
yeah,
changes things.
yeah,
That'll do a lot.
yeah,
You can also try, like slimming down the dialogue, like we were talking about, if you have that talking heads situation, or introduce a reason like a time constraint or them being overheard to force them to be much more concise and try to get their ideas across in much fewer words. A couple other thoughts here are just make something go wrong or harder to do. I know I've talked about this in the past. It helps with stagnation too. And then lastly, make the protagonist and the others interact with their setting more.
mhm,
So instead of just picking, oh, I'm going to make this setting, let's say, a busy library,
mhm.
make them take books off the shelves and try to use the Dewey Decimal System and
Right.
try to find somewhere to sit and be frustrated because their knee hurts and then find somewhere to sit on the floor and then the librarian, yells at them. Make them interact with these other aspects that aren't just dialogue, and that can really help with stagnation.
Do you like when it comes to stagnation, can it also be like a feel thing, like when you have like you've been in one person's POV for too long, like if you do a POV, I feel like sometimes that can also be a thing where it's like this person doesn't really have like internally their dialogue, first of all, has
Sure.
been missing, but also you know where they are. So there's not as much to know about their perspective, whereas you may have the other person who's in the scene, and it's like we haven't seen them for a minute, and maybe because we haven't seen their thing, there could be like more going on. There's more to explore. There's more to catch people up on, and it could give like it could sort of like shock it out of rather than having like go for like 3 chapters. It's like maybe switch it over. You know,
Yeah. I think you have a good
what do you think of
point
that?
there. I think you definitely have a point. But I think that the other ways that I've looked at POV in this scene, such as looking at who has the most at stake, looking at agency, looking at those kind
Mm-hmm.
of things, need to take precedence. So I'm not sure I'd say that it's a problem to have three, maybe four at a stretch POV scenes in a row from the same protagonist. However, if it's an option and you're not going to mess up those other more important factors by deciding to rearrange scenes so that you're doing more of an alternation, that can help.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's not an issue, but it is a tool that you can use if you're not screwing up the is this the right POV
Right,
for the scene kind of thing.
right. So how can we tell or decide which option for adding interest on that list you just gave us is the right choice? I think we touched on that a little bit, but tell
Yeah.
us more.
Yes. So to answer a little more specifically,
Yeah.
again, you really need to name the problem first And then if you really want to sit down and do this as an exercise, I recommend naming the problem and then naming what the positive desired opposite of that would be.
Mm,
So maybe you name the problem is talking heads. And then the alternate version of that that you want to write down is something along the lines of well balanced with action and dialogue, or dialogue is happening around something interesting happening. So once you have those two statements, you can just make the call right there. If the answer is, I need to slim down dialogue, great, no
mm,
further work needed.
right.
But if you're still not sure, you can just sit with that for a second and imagine how each of the optional fixes that I listed earlier would change the scene and how that scene transitions into the next. Sometimes when you do that, you'll think through and be like, okay, well, I currently have talking heads problem. What if I just slim down all of the dialogue to be a quarter as much spoken words as it currently is? Okay, well that would produce issues. I wouldn't be able to deliver all of the information that I need to. The
Mm,
conversation would feel unnaturally short and it would make the
mhm,
overall chapter too short to fit in with the flow of the story. All right, that's not the right
right.
option. So let's imagine through if I change the setting so that they're forced to do more around the dialogue. Okay, well, thinking through that, that's not going to make the scene too much longer. I'd only have to add, 300 words. And I can still do a little bit of slimming, but I don't have to lose any of the important information. And then when I transition to the next scene, it's going to feel even better because they're already in that part of town by changing the setting. Okay, then that's the right answer.
Mhm,
And then lastly, for deciding how you want to fix a stagnant scene, just save your current version of the scene. Because again, I always recommend just, I'm gonna put this over here in another document so it's not
mhm,
lost and I can revert if I need to. And then try applying a change and see if you like it or don't like it, or if you need to combine it with a different solution and play with that.
mhm. Well, I know we need to wrap up, but I do want to ask one last question. If we make all of our scenes interesting, doesn't that run the risk of them all feeling the same, which goes against what you were suggesting back in episode 13 on pacing?
Yes and no. So
Yeah.
the tip here, and this is one that I picked up from StoryGrid and then interpreted heavily, so take that with a grain of salt. But it's this idea of scene type variety. And I
Mm,
talked about this a little bit in the last episode, where the point of naming that core event was also making sure that they're all unique within the scope of that story. So if you have multiple scenes with the core event of they have a revealing conversation in a library, then those aren't unique core events and you need to change at least one of them so
mhm,
that they are all unique. And the way that I personally track this in my books, and I have done for clients when this was a big problem in their books, was just on whatever list of chapter names you have, put a little note next to them about the location. So that could
mhm,
be, oh, this is home, restaurant, bus, things like that. And then put another more descriptive single word like, this is a conversation scene. This is a fight scene. This is an argument scene. This is a self reflection scene, and check those for variety. Because a self reflection scene is going to probably have more description, maybe some action, less dialogue. An
mhm,
argument scene is going to be very heavy in dialogue, but still be balanced with some action and that tension and conflict. So, as long as you have variety in those locations, and if you would describe them as contemplative, fighting, moving forward, stumbling backwards, those kind of things, you should be all set in having enough variety that the reader isn't going to feel like it's getting repetitive.
mhm. That comes into a lot of, I write historical romance. And historical romance, it's like everything's like happening in a ballroom. And it's
Yes.
just like it can't everything can happen in a ballroom. Like let them go somewhere else for once in their life, right?
Right. But
So
even then,
yeah,
if you have five scenes that are set at balls or in ballrooms, one of those can be self reflective, one of those can be argumentative, one of those can be very, very flirty. You can
yeah,
have variety in the combinations, even if you have multiple scenes in the
yeah.
same setting or with the same type.
Or like indifferent, because I mean, a ball could they could be a dinner portion. They could be they're in the yard, they're in the garden,
Yeah.
right? They're dancing. Maybe she's just in the refreshments room. Like you could just be in different spots. Like you can't have every 5 minutes somebody's in a waltz, right? So even
Yep.
though it does
Great
make
point.
it easier, you know. Okay, so thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to doing a couple more episodes with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, next week, you and I will go over the often overlooked aspects of intangible world building, especially
Hmm.
for fantasy and historical fiction. For now, I would really like to thank everyone who follows along with this series. We would really appreciate it if you could help us out by liking and subscribing to the Heartbound Editing podcast and the Authors Alcove podcast, where you can find lots more content for fantasy and historical authors and readers beyond this joint series. I also very highly encourage you all to check out Addie's awesome interracial historical romance books at addydulacauthor.net. That is ADDYDULACAUTHOR.net. And to follow her on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Addy Dulac _author. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me on. Okay.